What if I told you that one of America's largest lakes is not just shrinking, but is actively becoming a time bomb of toxic dust? The Great Salt Lake, a critical economic and ecological hub, is rapidly disappearing. And its demise isn't just due to natural drought, it's a critical failure of modern resource management, driven by powerful corporate and agricultural interests. We often study the rise of business empires, but today on Legacy Archives, we are diving deep into a corporate legacy of thirst, analyzing the environmental catastrophe that threatens millions of lives and billions of dollars in economic loss. Stay with us, because the true cost of inaction is far more severe than you can imagine. For decades, this lake has served as a silent partner to Utah's economic growth. But now, it is demanding a terrible price. This isn't just a local issue, it's a terrifying case study in how resource depletion, fueled by unsustainable commercial demands, leads directly to environmental collapse. We will examine the industrial drivers, the political inertia, and the shocking toxic fallout that could turn Salt Lake City into a public health nightmare. First, we need to appreciate exactly what is at stake. The crisis of the Great Salt Lake is a legacy problem, rooted in historical decisions about who controls water and where it flows. It highlights the urgent need for accountability when short-term commercial gains overshadow long-term ecological stability. This is the central conflict we will unravel today. The Great Salt Lake isn't just a scenic landmark, it's a vital engine supporting multi-million-dollar industries. Crucially, the lake is extremely salty, which makes it perfect for mineral extraction. Companies here harvest valuable elements like magnesium and various salts, which are used globally in construction and manufacturing. These industries generate significant revenue and employ hundreds of people. Perhaps the most unique and surprisingly lucrative business tied to the lake is the brine shrimp harvesting sector. These tiny creatures, known as sea monkeys when sold as pets, are primarily harvested for aquaculture. They are essential feed for farmed shrimp and fish worldwide. This niche industry alone brings tens of millions of dollars into the state every year. But this industry depends entirely on the lake maintaining a specific salinity level. Beyond industry, the lake plays a critical environmental role that directly affects Utah's famous tourism sector. As the cold air passes over the relatively warm lake water, it generates what is known as lake effect snow. This heavy snowfall is essential for recharging the region's overall water supply and maintaining the quality of the snow that fuels Utah's massive ski resort economy. No lake, no snow. It's that simple. We are talking about billions in tourism revenue at risk. So how bad is the situation really? The scientific data is alarming. The Great Salt Lake has now hit its lowest recorded water level, dropping well below the historical average. Satellite imagery over the last few decades clearly shows the lake's surface area shrinking dramatically, exposing over 700 square miles of lake bed. Think of that. An area larger than London is now dry and exposed. While severe, persistent drought caused by climate change plays a part, it is not the main problem. The true driver of the lake's disappearance is unsustainable human water diversion. Rivers like the Bear, Jordan, and Weber, which once fed the lake, are now aggressively tapped upstream for human use. These diversions have prevented approximately 2/3 of the water that should enter the lake from reaching it. We are talking about billions of gallons diverted annually. This massive scale of water loss fundamentally changes the lake's ecosystem, concentrating the remaining water to dangerously high salinity levels and accelerating the exposure of the lake bed. This level of environmental impact demands that we look closely at who is using all this water. Before we continue this deep dive into the powerful interests controlling the flow, take a moment to hit that like button if you believe we need more transparency regarding corporate water usage. When we analyze who is responsible for the massive water diversion, the answer is clear: agriculture. In Utah, irrigation for farming consumes roughly 75% to 80% of the state's total water budget. This isn't just about small family farms, but large-scale commercial operations that rely on vast irrigation systems to grow water-intensive crops, particularly alfalfa and hay, which are used to feed livestock. It might surprise you that a significant portion of this alfalfa and hay is not even consumed locally. Some is exported internationally, highlighting a profound dilemma. We are essentially exporting the Great Salt Lake's water in the form of livestock feed, all while the primary source of that water disappears. This dynamic pits powerful agricultural entities against the urban centers and the environment. The control these businesses have over water is locked in place by antiquated legal structures known as senior water rights. In simple terms, this first-in-time, first-in-right system means that the oldest users, often large agricultural operations established over a century ago, get priority. They must have their water needs met completely before any junior rights holders, including cities or environmental needs, get anything. This framework makes it almost impossible to implement immediate, mandatory conservation measures. Since these water rights are treated as private property, there is little financial incentive for senior rights holders to conserve. In fact, if they use less, they risk losing their claim in the future. This system directly contributes to the crisis. It's a classic example of corporate and agricultural legacy interests prioritizing extraction over sustainability, even when the entire region faces disaster. If the shrinking lake simply meant a smaller body of water, it would be bad, but manageable. But here's the frightening reality. The exposed lake bottom is laced with toxic heavy metals. Over decades, industrial runoff, mining waste, and decades of pollution have settled into the sediment. When the water evaporates, all that contamination, arsenic, selenium, mercury, is left exposed to the air. This is what truly makes the Great Salt Lake's demise a global threat. When strong winds sweep across the dried, exposed lake bed, they lift this contaminated sediment into massive, hazardous dust plumes. We are talking about particles fine enough to be inhaled deep into the lungs. These toxic dust clouds pose an imminent danger to the Wasatch Front, the region stretching along the mountains that is home to over 2.5 million residents, including Salt Lake City itself. It's an almost unstoppable method of contamination. These plumes can travel for hundreds of miles, depositing toxic particles directly into residential areas, schools, and workplaces. Experts warn that breathing this air would dramatically increase the risk of severe respiratory illnesses, neurological damage, and certain types of cancer. This isn't a future problem, hell, it's a current and accelerating danger. The resulting public health crisis from this toxic dust will impose a crushing financial burden on the state. Imagine a massive spike in long-term health issues linked to arsenic and heavy metal exposure. We are talking about increased rates of asthma, lung disease, and premature death. The cost of hospitalization, specialized treatment, and chronic care would quickly overwhelm the regional healthcare system. But the financial damage doesn't stop at healthcare. This pervasive air contamination will severely affect the region's long-term economic stability. Companies thrive in areas with high quality of life. If the air becomes dangerously toxic, corporate investment will cease, residents will leave, and the appeal of the entire Wasatch Front will be destroyed. Productivity will fall and property values will plummet. It becomes a spiraling economic decline. The price tag for cleaning up the environmental damage and managing the health fallout could easily enter the hundreds of billions of dollars. And unlike traditional corporate risks, this is an existential threat to the state's primary economic engine, a cost that simply cannot be insured against. It truly shows the immense legacy cost of ignoring environmental warnings. We already touched on the brine shrimp industry, but the ecological consequences are even more profound. The Great Salt Lake's unique ecosystem depends on precise salinity levels. As the water volume decreases, salinity rises past the tolerable limit for the brine shrimp. When the shrimp disappear, the entire food web collapses. This is devastating for the harvesting industry we discussed earlier. The fallout extends far beyond local economies. The Great Salt Lake is a critical stopover point on the Pacific Flyway, a major route for migratory birds in North and South America. Millions of birds, including species like Wilson's phalaropes and American avocets, depend on the brine shrimp and the unique shallow water habitat for feeding and nesting during their long journeys. If this resource disappears, millions of birds will have nowhere to go. The loss of this feeding ground creates a cascade effect across the entire hemisphere's ecological balance. The environmental disaster at the Great Salt Lake is an international responsibility, affecting ecosystems hundreds or even thousands of miles away. The health of the entire flyway depends on the survival of this one lake. Despite clear scientific warnings and the terrifying threat of toxic dust, implementing mandatory, effective water restrictions is proving almost impossible. Why? Because the crisis is fundamentally political. Powerful agricultural interests, often represented by influential lobbying groups, fiercely resist any legislation that threatens their senior water rights or reduces their access to water. For politicians, challenging this established system means confronting highly organized, powerful corporate entities. The legal complexities surrounding the century-old water rights laws create enormous political inertia. To save the lake, lawmakers must find a way to redirect water use away from the powerful senior holders toward conservation and environmental needs. This requires a complete reevaluation of who owns the resource and how it should be allocated, a political battle that few are willing to fight seriously. If you are learning something new about how corporate power affects our environment, please consider subscribing to Legacy Archives. We break down these complex power structures every week. While many solutions are known, the political will to enact them is lacking because the short-term cost to powerful business interests is seen as too high. This struggle between established commercial operations and public welfare defines the crisis. Unless that political calculation changes, the lake will continue to shrink. To understand the true gravity of the situation, we must look at a devastating historical precedent: the Aral Sea. Once the fourth largest lake in the world, it was destroyed by massive, unsustainable water diversion by the Soviet Union, primarily to irrigate cotton crops in the desert. The parallels with the Great Salt Lake are frighteningly clear: massive agricultural diversion leading to catastrophic environmental and economic collapse. The consequences for the region around the Aral Sea were devastating. The thriving fishing industry collapsed entirely, leading to mass unemployment and poverty. The exposed seabed, contaminated with fertilizer residue and industrial chemicals, created massive, toxic dust storms that caused widespread public health crises and altered the local climate. Today, huge stretches of the Aral Sea are a literal wasteland, dotted with abandoned ships in the sand. The Aral Sea is not just a cautionary tale, it's a chilling high-definition forecast of the socio-economic future awaiting Utah if no radical action is taken immediately. It demonstrates that when resource management fails due to powerful, short-sighted economic demands, the environmental and financial consequences are profound and largely irreversible. The difference is that the Aral Sea crisis affected a sparsely populated region. The Great Salt Lake crisis threatens a major modern metropolitan area. If the problem is rooted in corporate and economic policy, the solution requires massive financial commitment. The only realistic way to save the lake is to increase water flow dramatically, and that means redirecting water away from agriculture. The most straightforward solution is often the most expensive: purchasing water rights from farmers. Other proposed solutions involve immensely costly infrastructural projects. These include lining canals to prevent leakage, encouraging the transition to less water-intensive crops, and even constructing massive pipelines to transfer water from distant, underutilized sources. These are not cheap, short-term fixes. We are talking about multi-billion-dollar investments requiring decades of commitment. On the urban side, aggressive water conservation mandates are essential. This means higher water pricing, strict limits on outdoor watering, and incentives for commercial entities to adopt closed-loop water systems. Saving the lake requires a collective effort, but the most profound sacrifices must come from the sectors that have benefited the most from the unsustainable status quo: large-scale agriculture and industry. The financial resources must be found now, or the future costs will be unbearable. We often analyze corporate legacies in terms of innovation and financial success. But the crisis at the Great Salt Lake forces us to consider a far darker legacy: the environmental debt incurred by powerful interests, prioritizing immediate resource utilization over long-term stability. This is a profound failure of corporate and political accountability. This disaster demonstrates that environmental costs, initially externalized by corporations onto the public and the ecosystem, eventually return as economic devastation. The businesses that profit from the water diversion today will not be the ones cleaning up the toxic dust or paying the spiraling healthcare costs of tomorrow. That financial burden falls entirely on the taxpayers and the residents. What kind of environmental and economic legacy will the current generation of leaders leave behind? The fate of the Great Salt Lake is a moral test case for global resource management. Inaction guarantees catastrophic, irreversible harm to a region that supports millions. Action requires massive spending, political courage, and a commitment to reform archaic laws that protect the status quo. The crisis facing the Great Salt Lake is more than just a localized issue. It is a critical warning for every major metropolitan area that relies on increasingly strained natural resources. It shows us what happens when competing economic demands and powerful legacies are not managed with strict environmental oversight. This is the blueprint for future corporate-driven environmental decline worldwide, and it serves as a stark reminder of the true price of resource exploitation. If you found this deep dive into the intersection of corporate power and environmental collapse valuable, please let us know by hitting the like button. To ensure you never miss our detailed examinations of business history and power, Subscribe to Legacy Archives and turn on notifications. What region do you think is next to face such a critical resource crisis? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you in the next analysis.